Hey, everybody. Welcome to the second hour of the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Sending all my love to Gary Hines of Sounds of Blackness and Reverend McAfee and Spike and all my people up there. It's Representative Ilhan Omar, Senator Klobuchar, all my folks. Keith Ellison, I love you, love you, love you all. It's a joy to be with you today. Please meet us on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. That way you can join the Morning Stars, the Santita Jackson Morning Stars, and get involved in the conversation. We want to hear what you have to say. They have a whole lot that they're talking about throughout the show. And the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. I can't take anyone on the Santita Jackson page, but Santita Jackson and Friends, please be my friend there, everybody. I love you, love you, love you.
Love you.
Love you, love you, love you. I got a tremendous panel to talk about where we are in 2024. Many people have called this the post-racial era, the post-Obama era. And maybe, according to John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, when he pulled out the heart of the Voting Rights Act, he said, look, America's not racist the way it was. We've had a black president. You don't need pre-clearance in the most racist, vote-denying areas of the United States. Mm-hmm. And on and on and on it's gone. And it's not just confined to color, everybody. In Florida, this just happened. The Florida House of Representatives, Wisconsin State Representative Lakeisha Myers. I'm not calling you to account for this, for any of this, but strange things are happening in Florida and Wisconsin. They voted to approve legislation specifically intended to prohibit local workplace standards requiring drinking water, cooling measures, recovery periods for people who are working out in the heat now, posting or distributing materials informing workers how to protect themselves, requiring first aid or emergency responses. That was approved.
And what was that all about? I mean, why would you do something like that?
Well, Dr. Robert Starks, Professor Emeritus, Northeastern Illinois University, you can explain this to us. And Reverend Dr. Todd Deary, Esquire, National Leadership Team of Rainbow Push, perhaps you could explain this as we're looking at people who need special protections in the United States in 2024. I'm saying working people, brown-skinned people, black-skinned people. Mm-hmm. It appears to me they need some special protections. Dwight McKee, noted social scientist, dean of the Ma'afa Redemption Project, also senior advisor to Dr. Cornel West in his presidential campaign. Of course, general counsel for the National Council of Negro Women, former vice president of Rainbow Push, my big sister. That's right, from Greenville, not Greenville, South Carolina. South Carolina. And of course, Wisconsin State Representative Lakeisha Myers. It's just a simple question, and I'm going to start with you, Attorney Janice Mathis. Do black people, do brown people, do women, people who've historically faced discrimination, do we need special protections in 2024 America?
My answer is yes, of course we do. You look at the landscape, you look at where employment is, you look at where housing is, you look at education. Of course we need special protection. You've got legislatures trying to erase Black history. You've got people, legislatures that are not willing to increase the minimum wage. Of course we need protection. But I want to flip the script just a little bit and say, what is it that the nation has to lose by not protecting us? What group of people have fought in every war? What group of people are consistently loyal? You know, I think about back in the days when I was dating a lot. It's easy to love a tall, handsome, good-looking, kind guy.
Yes.
But to love somebody with flaws, and I think about the United States as a flawed nation, you got to really be a patriot to love a flawed nation. And that's what we've got. We've got a nation that from its inception was born and conceived in racism and manipulation and predatory capitalism. But in spite of all, we've got so much invested in it that we can't walk away from it. So we don't have much choice but to try to improve it.
Okay. State Representative Lakeisha Myers.
I would say yes, we still need those protections. Just thinking of the historical aspects of what Attorney Mathis talked about in her comments, we still need these protections because we've not yet arrived. And I don't think America has arrived to any type of recompense for the history that we arrived here under, the conditions that we arrived here under or were put through since we've been here. So I think until you're trying to um level the playing field, get us closer to a catch up point. I mean, I look at it from the perspective and the vantage point of, we more than a 400-year head start other people had on us. So I think we're doing pretty good for right now, even though we're not in a perfect situation. I think we've done well given the circumstances. But I think we are most definitely owed more, and should have the opportunity to do more, to achieve the American dream. And even when you have to put the air quotes in that, because what is the dream? When you think about that, it was something that was an idealized version of immaterial reality, really, when you look at it in that perspective. But for us to even have the opportunity to achieve what others have had the opportunity to achieve, I think we have to have certain protections in place for our community.
Dr. Bob Starks.
Yes, we definitely need special protection because we need, first of all, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to be passed in the Congress. We also need the police uh, legislation that was proposed, named after George Floyd. We also need protection when it comes to looking at the whole issue of reparations. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we need protection on. Like your previous guest said, we need to look at Black history. They're wiping out Black history starting in Florida. I don't know where that legislation is at the moment. I understand that the governor tried to force all of the teachers in the history departments in the state-owned colleges to rewrite the books on Black history. That's insanity. That's absolute insanity. And we cannot, as uh, concerned Black people, let that go by without challenging it.
Hmm. Reverend Dr. Uri, your thoughts.
Well, I think the obvious answer is yes, we still need the protections.
Mm-hmm.
The clear response though has to come with what's the justification. There's a sense,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's coming from the Chief Justice or from others, that the need for protections is really a sentimental one, not one based on evidence.
Right.
But when we look at the numbers, when we look at the outcomes and the effects, when we compare simple things, right? What's the value of a house owned by a Black person compared to the same house owned by a white person in the same neighborhood? There's a
Mm-hmm.
distinction because of race. It requires protection
Exactly.
of the law.
Right.
When you look at sentences in the criminal legal system, disparities amongst charges for the same crime committed in the same jurisdiction, the only distinction is one of race. You will get a longer sentence and a harsher outcome for the Black person than you will the white person. That's documented. That's evidence. When you look at the wage gap, a person hired for the same job in the same place, with a Black person actually having greater academic credentials and qualifications, will often get paid less than a white person, particularly a white male with a high school diploma. So these are not figments of our imagination. This is called government data. And I would only point you to the Kerner Commission report that was chaired by Otto Kerner, who was former governor of Illinois, went to the federal bench before he ended up having to resign for his own criminality. That whole commission says that the problem in America, it comes down to two words. It's in the document. It's a government document. It is called white racism. And it talks about how the racist superstructure is reinforced. It is condoned by white indifference. It is reinforced by white interpretation of law. And now that we are going back to the new revision of history, this is not the first one. This is just the next one. We find ourselves fighting in the same way over the same issues. This is not a settled matter. And until we get the full implementation and the protection of the law, we've got more fighting to do. That is the answer.
Dwight McKee.
Well, a big problem you got with it all is that it's the courts are trying to move away from race-based remedies, and they're trying to move, quote unquote, to a race-neutral society. And so, using race now as a remedy to be very, very, very difficult to get passed on the courts. I think what we have to begin to do is strategically either expand the notion of discrimination, both in fact and in theory, so that we have to prove race discrimination now by census tract or by zip code or by the preponderance of evidence that is race effective but race neutral as you construct the database. So it does not look like it's pure race based because what they now require you to do is to prove specifics or discrimination rather than general discrimination. And so now we have to also expand the notion to include other folk that's been discriminated against, with even though they have not been as egregiously discriminated against, you can also prove discrimination against them, and you can expand the notion so it's not purely race based. The ones very interesting enough that's trying to create this race neutral society, the perception are the ones who are the most racist themselves. And so that's the real contradiction. Is this the racists now they quote Dr. King more than anybody else to talk about the color of skin, content of character. I mean, they abuse that now
Mhm.
and misapply it in such a way that it almost looked like if you talk about discrimination and racism, that you are anti Dr. King, anti civil rights, anti beloved community. Interesting paradox.
We're having Delta Day up on the hill, our sorority, Janice Mathis. Are Black women and our issues getting lost in the sauce at all? I mean, because we tend to, I mean, not to separate Black women out, but we're still at the bottom of the pile in terms of what we earn. We lose $1 million on average over the course of our work lives. We lose more than Black men do because we're so vastly underpaid. Um, and we're just seeing white women being attacked. So when you see white women being attacked and Black folks being attacked, and then we are Black and women, gee whiz, am I right to be looking at it that way?
I think you're absolutely right. If you add let's imagine a world where environmentalists and people who are protective of reproductive freedom and people who believe in voting rights act and people who believe in the right to organize your workplace, that's a majority of Americans. What has happened to us is that we now have a minority trying to run a democratic majoritarian, so-called majoritarian government. One of the things that probably is going to be left up to us to do, because we're the only folk that will understand it, is that we got to build bridges to some of these communities with which we have common political and economic issues, even though we don't share the history and the culture. But we've got to build some of those relationships. I was just sitting here making a list. Back in and I can't help but think about the history because I'm old. In 78, there was a seminal Supreme Court case about affirmative action called Bakke. Bakke wanted to go to medical school out in California. He didn't get in, and he sued because he said his grades and test scores were higher than some Black folk who got in. You know what upheld affirmative action in 78?
Mm.
It wasn't making things even for Black people. Lewis Powell, one justice, wrote a concurring opinion, not even the majority opinion, said the issue is diversity. That's where we get the concept of diversity from, out of the Bakke case. That schools that have diverse student bodies produce better scholarship, better relationships, better understanding among Americans. That was the linchpin for this whole thing we now call diversity and DEI. But we backed away from that. The good news is demographics is on our side. Right now, if you look at kids who are in kindergarten, there is no majority. They're black and white and Hispanic and all other Asian. There is no, and that's what the country is going to look like in another 30, 40 years. It may not even take to 2040. And I think what the white population is afraid of and refuses to concede, they can't imagine not being in the majority. They
Mhm.
can't imagine not being able to have their way in everything, in every aspect of American life. But whether they like it, don't like it, can't stand it, might be able to live with it, it's coming. And I'm afraid that this contention among us, the closer we get to the lack of a majority, California doesn't have a majority now, population,
Mhm.
that it's going to be even more contentious. And we probably got some pretty stiff battles yet to fight.
Well, I mean, State Representative Lakeisha Myers from Wisconsin. I mean, you all have had some battles up there because Wisconsin, the pendulum goes from right to left, hard right, hard left. You know, an urban America where black people are under the boot, a rural America where white farmers are struggling. But then you have these vibrant college communities and wealthy communities. I mean, you have everything there. You have a right wing government who forced our beloved former Senator Lena to run away. Just, I mean, talk to me. I mean, what are we seeing? Because where you are, people get contracts or they don't. I mean,
They do get contracts or they don't, but I think similar to what Attorney Mathis just talked about, when you talk about the concept of diversity,
Mhm.
that is now a dirty word in the state of Wisconsin, just
So
like
what's
it
happening
is.
specifically with that? Because so many of us don't realize how many of these private businesses get wealthy off of government contracts.
Well, after the decision that came out from the Supreme Court regarding affirmative action, there was, like, I don't know what to call it. It was a excitement, if you will,
Mhm.
excitement in the legislature to now de-diversify everything. And that meant things like the Minority Teacher Loan Program, which is a loan program that specifically targets African Americans, Latinos, Hmong Americans. We have a large Hmong population in Wisconsin. For those individuals to go through the teaching process and to teach at predominantly Title I schools or schools that will be considered harder to staff, or in a subject area like special ed or mathematics or science, specifically in those particular schools. So they were like, oh, well, we shouldn't have anything called the Minority Teacher Loan Program. We don't need a special loan program for minorities. If it's just for poor people, then that should take care of other people. And I'm like, no, it's the Minority Teacher Loan Program for a reason, because the majority of the teaching staff in most public schools is white women between the age of 22 and 35. So, even with looking at that, you're pulling away from the targeted demographic that exists. So
Mhm.
looking at it from that perspective, and then with our highest, the committee that has the most power in the state of Wisconsin is our Committee on Joint Finance. They are the budget writing committee in Wisconsin. They actually held up funding that was already allocated for the University of Wisconsin system if they did not do specific provisions to take away diversity and inclusion. So all of their diversity officers have been reallocated, and they are now like coded under student success coaches or something else where you don't really know it could be or could not be a diversity, equity, and inclusion position. A lot of funding that went to attraction and retention of Black and Latino students to the University of Wisconsin, the flagship University of Wisconsin school, is going to be reallocated. They held up money for the campus's engineering building. on at the flagship campus because they wanted them to take away what is it called, the um, diversity and inclusion statements that said, like, by, I don't know, I'm making this up, like by 2030 we want to have a specific population that is more representative of Wisconsin, and that includes having 10% non-white students on our campus. The University of Wisconsin has 50,000 students on its flagship campus. They can never reach above 2 to 3% of a Black population on that campus, and that's been a long time ago, years in the making. So they've always had an issue with race or racism on the UW's campus. So it was things like that we started to see them trying to peel away at a lot of the policies and programs that existed. They wanted to go back into state statute and change a lot of our contracting alignments that said you had to have a certain number of minority contractors have the ability to bid on state contracts. All of that has slowly but surely started to be stripped away. The only stopgap in this measure has been that we've had a Democratic governor who was not going for it. But if that were to ever change, I'm sure it would be reintroduced within a heartbeat, and they would try to pass that. So all of these things have been introduced, aside from the joint finance measures that have stripped away the other provisions specifically dealing with the University of Wisconsin programming and their dollars that were allocated. They've not been able to do as much as Florida has done just yet.
But Dr. Starks, we see this happening. We're seeing it play out in Florida, like removing the books, the history from the schools.
Right.
What they're doing.
Florida is most definitely the archetype, Santita.
It's the archetype,
Absolutely.
but that's the
Absolutely.
point. It's the archetype. But I see an implementation plan for the rest of the United States. Dr. Starks.
I think what disturbs me about this is it is trying to wipe out the essence of the critical race theory, i.e., that things should not be based on race, as Dwight said, based on I don't know what. I mean, if you do not include race as criteria and diversity, how do you do that? Tell me how you do that at the university level. I mean, when I taught at the university, that was one of the major factors. And as the state representative from Wisconsin said, it allows the University of Wisconsin and other universities to stop recruiting on the basis of race. What happens to potential students in this regard?
Well, I mean, you tell me. I mean, because I see.
I don't know.
No, I see an attack on the vote.
Yeah.
I see an attack on working people.
Mm-hmm.
And we see the attacks, but you can't call it out by name.
Right. And then, of course, the major proponent of this ancestral crazy stuff is Clarence Thomas, who could not have gotten into Yale if he were not Black, and if affirmative action had not been in place at the time that he got
but wait a minute. Hold on. He's angry with affirmative action because he didn't need affirmative action. And because affirmative action was in place, everybody doubted his abilities. That's his justification.
No, it's crazy. So he's supposed to be extremely smart. And okay, give me.
But affirmative action, unlike legacies, people who are in affirmative action programs meet the baseline qualifications.
Of course.
Legacy students do not.
Of course, you're right. You're right. Legacy students do not, because their parents give big money to the university and land or whatever, and they get in based on legacy, not on
merit.
Merit. Right? Exactly. Well, I want to hear from Dwight. Why? How do you deal with this? You made a long statement about wiping out race as a criteria. What do you replace it with?
Whatever can work. But I think that, one, we have to stop hallucinating, thinking somehow white people are going to be fair. Is the whole notion of white supremacy is for them to stay in charge.
Right.
And since they've stopped having babies and their population has gone down, they're going to do anything that they can do to reduce our power at the voting booth,
Mm-hmm.
or our numbers showing up, or us dealing with redress for racism.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can't approach it as if somehow they're going to be fair. Whatever we come up with, there's going to be some kind of scheme or not that they have to uh, to contradict it or neutralize it.
Mm-hmm.
So the only approach I see that's it workable is for us to develop, build, and depend on Black institutions. So we should really strategically send our kids to Black colleges and invest as much as we can in those colleges.
Okay.
We have
That
to
that makes sense. It makes sense.
buy from each other,
Mm-hmm.
create Black investment institutions, Black banks, and invest in each other, borrow from each other, loan to each other. We have to do what the other groups, the Chinese, the Hispanics, when they come here, they really don't depend on affirmative action and government contracts. They come in as a group, see each other as their own salvation, and create their own institutions in their own community. When you go in Pilsen, Pilsen is
In
a
Chicago.
Pilsen in Chicago
Mhm.
is almost a independent little nation there. They have
Yeah.
everything they need.
Right
They have
there.
right at hand.
That is
Well,
true.
but I think also when you're looking at Pilsen and when you look at when you look at the Jewish community, when you look at these other communities, they come from a place of abundance, if you will. Many of us, if I may complete this thought, um, come from a place of lack of looking at what's been taken from us. I'd say that for the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
So that becomes problematic. And because our leaders have been inspirational leaders who put the spirit back in us so we could know we're enough.
Yes, not what we have, it's how we deal with what we have.
I
Is
agree.
is they have a self uh independent thought process that they don't even think outside themselves. When you go to Chinatown, they think Chinese first,
Of course.
and then the rest of the world. Jews
Mhm.
think Jews first,
Mm-hmm.
and then the rest of the world. We think America first, and then please, in America, in your beneficence, please find us a place and take care of us.
Well,
We think Democratic Party first.
right. That that even
Or
extends to
or
the
Republican
church.
Party, depending upon the moment. And the thing is, I think we're saying the same thing though, Dwight. And that's why I'm saying that's still coming from a place of lack because you don't feel that you're good enough. And
Mm-hmm.
that is something that fundamentally has to change. I remember when my parents bought their house in Washington, D.C., which was right on the Howard campus. People thought they were crazy, because the neighborhood was struggling and all of that. But my parents said, well, maybe if we move here, the people who've been renting here for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe we can help them to understand how they can buy a house. Because, see, my parents are from the South where you buy your house.
That's
And
a big
maybe if
thing.
we move in here, maybe if they see us here, because when I lived, Dr. So-and-so lived down the street. So that gave me something to which I could aspire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
now the neighborhood is unaffordable
Absolutely.
for almost the wealthy.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not sure we're saying the same thing because I'm saying
No,
our lack is not as real as we think it is. For example, let me give
no,
you a
no, no,
couple of
but
good
no, wait a
examples.
minute, wait a minute.
Let
You
me
say
finish my point.
no. Let me finish my point because my point is, I'm not saying that our lack is not. I'm not saying it is real. I'm saying that process, we've got to get out of that. Because when I share Black history with many young people, they're shocked that we have done so many great things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, let me finish my point. For example,
Okay.
let me give you a good example. Is that west side of Chicago, which was 25 years ago a desert,
Mm-hmm.
right
Mm-hmm.
around the United Center,
Mm-hmm.
the desert. It was all old warehouses that were abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
Once the mayor then put a plan together to regentrify that
Mm-hmm.
community. What they set some money aside to redevelop the community. But at the same time, what really brought their community back was two things: Michael Jordan and Oprah
Mhm.
Winfrey.
Absolutely.
Michael at the United Center. Oprah, people came by to her little operation there by
Mhm.
the thousands. White people came every day to sit down in that little place. Oprah and Michael then had the capacity to buy all those abandoned warehouses that was in that neighborhood. There was dirt cheap. Some of them was in were being abandoned. Together they could have bought 3 city miles,
Mhm.
control all of that money in that neighborhood, and created a $1 billion situation in Chicago. Oprah spent $50 million on a house in California.
And all I'm saying is, I'm saying the same thing because that is what my parents tried to do in Washington. And they tried to get black people to move into the neighborhood, and they refused because they moved to the Gold Coast in Washington, where their houses were already $1 million. What I'm simply saying to you is that what happened on the West Side, because that's where I went to high school, Whitney Young. Because when I went to Whitney Young, you had to duck on the bus, but when you got there,
Mhm.
but the anchor for the West Side was the University of Illinois, which was a commuter school, but it was always going to be a
Mhm.
rival to Champaign-Urbana,
Mhm.
and then Rush Presbyterian St. Luke. You don't put a hospital with that many resources and that kind of university in a neighborhood that they plan to have fail. And
Mhm.
then they put Whitney Young,
Mhm.
where the school superintendent's daughter was pulled out of her high school to go, where the CTU, the teachers union's son, went into that school. They pulled these kids out of their high schools. Now, mind you, I got into high schools all my scores because Reverend was too controversial for me to get in on the skids. Okay.
And,
And so my mother would say, as she would drive me or have me driven there in the morning, because it was a little dangerous to take the bus in the morning. So my girlfriends and I our parents would drive us over there or get us as close to the school as they possibly could.
mhm. Well,
My mother said, don't worry, but let me tell you something. And by the time you get out of here, these houses that we see will be multi-million
been
dollar
done.
houses.
Santita, tell everybody who your classmate was.
Well, I mean, but her father was a city worker.
Right.
That's Michelle
Michelle
Levon
Obama.
Robinson. And so a lot of people, she's one of my classmates, but I mean, you had a lot of prominent kids who went to Whitney Young, children of prominent folks and people whose parents were in the machine.
Mhm.
And my
Mhm.
parents were on the outside of all of that. My point is that the point they would, and then they brought Oprah over there.
Yeah,
Then
but
they revitalized the United Center. I don't think that there's a lot of daylight between us, Dwight.
yeah, and I'm saying that, and that's why I'm talking about a mindset. Is that what was happening? Is that Michael's money was being invested by David Falk. He was his agent. He was taking all the money Michael was making, was hundreds of millions of dollars.
Mhm.
He was investing them in limited partnerships in the Jewish community. And so he made, because he was controlling Michael's money, he was making his own community rich. We
Mhm.
have basketball players with 300, 400, 500 million dollar contracts,
Mhm.
but they
Mhm.
all have white agents other than LeBron, who's,
Yvonne, right.
who's investing their money in the partnerships with their own people.
And then go back to Expo. The part of the reason that the whole Expo movement was started by Reverend Jackson. Part of the reason that we had to stop Expo was because the big black acts no longer had black managers. So we couldn't get them to come. When Percy Sutton opened the Apollo, he couldn't get black acts to come and perform at the Apollo. And on and on. And we're saying the same thing. It's a mindset.
It's a mindset. That's all I'm
No,
saying.
no,
Here,
It's not
here's
resources.
you and I
Okay.
are saying the same thing.
Okay.
I'm
there,
saying the lack,
there
Okay.
there's there's if
which
there
is a mindset. And when you have, because my parents tried to do that in their neighborhood to lock down LaDroit Park, which was a historically black neighborhood where Paul Lawrence Dunbar lived, for example. And we abandoned that. And now there are no black people there. My parents and a couple other black families are the only black families who are left after 100 years.
Mhm.
So there's some basic things that we can be doing to help ourselves. There's no question about it. And we have to continue to push to make that happen. You have to change a mindset because we keep thinking that we need somebody else to do for us and we don't.
But that's a mindset that we need to look at very seriously. Uh, Look at it from a religious perspective, because I think when we were in slavery and shortly thereafter in the Reconstruction period, we were taught not to trust each other,
Mm.
not to cooperate with each other. And that a part of that is right with us today. Is that right, McKee?
Yes, yes, sir. And that's all I'm saying. And so if we keep looking to the white to affirmative action and these courts and these politicians to remedy this, and I'm suggesting that it's in their interest to
To
keep
keep it,
keep
yeah.
us in and keep us down, and
Of
they're gonna
course,
do everything they do to keep us down.
of course it is.
And so we have to start thinking of new remedies, which was the question: is what can we do to get out of this?
Yeah, that
And
was my
So,
question because I'm not looking for new remedies. I know the old remedies work.
so,
You know.
so,
So I mean, Reverend Dr. Yeri, why don't you jump in? I see Janice Mathis is still here. Reverend Dr. Yeri.
can
Dr.
you hear
Erie,
me?
how does the church deal with this problem?
I want to deal with it a couple of ways. It's not one,
Hmm.
the church
Hmm.
is the largest asset holder of black wealth in the country. Full
Hmm.
stop.
Hmm.
So, number one, there is economic capital. When Dwight McKee talks about starting black banks, at the peak, black owned banks were started in basements of black churches.
Mm-hmm.
Let's be real clear. Um, what happened was regulation and competition squeezed local black bank interests out. And I'll give you a case in point. The most recent Great Recession that started in '07, leading up to the election in '08 that carried over into President Obama's first term. The Treasury Department came up with bailouts and stress tests.
Hmm.
Banks that did not pass the stress tests were forced into either closure or merger.
Hmm.
Now, here's what happened with that. What stress testing came down to was liquidity versus the risk of your paper. The reason I know is because when I came to Baltimore, I inherited the CEO of our church credit union, which was the oldest black credit union in the state of Maryland, and a CDFI, a community development financial institution. NCUA put us through a stress test because your reserves had to be a multiple of your loans. If you did not have that much of liquid capital, you were forced into consolidation. Black banks were stressed. And if you took federal money, the bailout that big banks could without the same kind of risks, it limited your ability to put new loans on the street. So you really couldn't make money to get from under the thumb of the government to be able to put new loans on the street. And black banks tended to lend to black people. But because of the structure of credit scoring and asset value and all of that, it made our paper, what we would call our loans, worth less because they were rated lower. And so, what we're talking about is I hear Dwight talking about having individual ownership and investment in our community, but let's be real clear. When white folks are leveraging a $6 trillion annual budget coming from the feds to benefit them,
Hmm.
and another almost $3 trillion that flows through state budgets benefiting them, there is no one Oprah, one Michael Jordan that's going to challenge the structural impediments that continue to reinforce the disadvantage. We got to be real clear on that. And when we go back and look at it, if we don't change the rules, we'll miss what just happened last year in the UNC Harvard case. It's called UNC Harvard, but let me tell you what it is. It is the 2024 version of Plessy.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they get
Hmm.
rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, not just in terms of who you hire, but who you spend your money with, who you're going to contract, where you're going to place your money in terms of banking, it has changed the dynamic. And separate but equal, we already know was a legal farce, but it was necessary to protect the advantage that now shows up in the look back when we talk about funding HBCUs. A 30-year look back by the federal government of state land grant institutions said that white governmental entities underfunded HBCUs by $13 billion over the last 30 years, not
Hmm.
even going all the way back to time. So what we've got to be is very clear. Having a Ketanji Brown Jackson on the U.S. Supreme Court means a whole lot because she is historically aware. I would suggest two things. Number one, we should all read Cheryl Harris's Harvard Law Review article from 1993 called Whiteness as Property. Whiteness is the ultimate property right. It has a value, it has presumed entitlement, it has enforcement capacity, and it has the full faith and credit of the United States government behind it. Everybody else is competing for relevance and consideration. And the way we have to do that, yes, we have to invest internally. Yes, we have to protect our own institutions. But in this year, when we've got the presidential election, 435 members of the House, 1/3 of the Senate, down ballot initiatives where they're going to be authorizations for state governments and local governments to spend public dollars for particular interests, we got to do a better job of educating our folks how to play Monopoly. Because this game is about the money.
And that's what I meant. I use them as an example, but I know we ain't going to have salvation in one or two Negroes. I'm talking about us as a people having a mindset. Because as a people, we are the 5th or 6th richest nation in the world. But we have to begin to think as a people and not even as individuals.
And here's where I would push thinking as a people. As what would be the 5th richest nation in the world, our labor, our ingenuity, our creativity, our stability, our resilience has created the most wealthy nation in the world. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to get relevance as an aside from the thing that we built. If the budget is there's a reason why a wanna pretend billionaire who's about to be broke because of judgments would decide that he wants to take a government job that pays $400,000 a year and requires him to live in public housing called 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And it's because he can redistribute the wealth. The budget starts from the recommendations of the president, and then the House of Representatives takes it up first. If we don't pay attention to the process by which public dollars are spent to fund private interests, and make sure that when we have a Lakeisha Myers in Wisconsin fighting over the budget, trying to make sure there are appropriations, trying to make sure students get what they need. When we have, now she's a judge, but we had Lena, right, doing it, but now she's interpreted law. We've got to make sure that we understand it. If you ever read the rules of monopoly and the Kerner Commission report, which are the rules in America, the most important person in the game of monopoly is the banker. And the biggest bank in the country is the U.S. Treasury.
And the game
do not get it twisted. And the game is monopoly.
And the game is monopoly.
It's monopoly.
But in our mindset, if I can just respond real quickly, and I'll let Lakeisha have it.
No, I've got to go to doctor. I've got to go to attorney.
All right. In our mindset, even our politicians, when they get in office, they think general rather than specific. They think the them rather than the us. Mm-hmm. And so they primarily get there. And the first thing they say is, we have to be inclusive because we represent all of the people. Whereas the other politicians think their ethnicity first and then everybody else. And that's why I keep going back to a mindset. Exactly. We more than anybody else work hard to be the broad while we get beat up by the narrow. And so I see you nodding your head, so I'll let you take it from here.
No, I'm going to go over here because that was my point about the lack in our mindset. And when we begin to understand that we are somebody and that we are more than enough, that's going to change. Attorney Mathis, because I just got some information from her today. I don't know if you've heard this, Dr. Starks, and you just heard them just earlier, State Representative Myers, Dwight McKee, and Reverend Dr. Yeary. Secretary Marsha Fudge has resigned.
Really? She was prominent on TV on the night of the
State of the Union.
State of the Union. She was smiling. What happened?
Well, I mean, Attorney Mathis?
Well, I don't know all the ins and outs. The reason she gave was that she wanted to spend more time with her mother, who is 93 years old and in failing health. And it's not unusual for cabinet members to have a shakeup in an election year
That is
Mhm.
true.
because you want to go out while your person who appointed you is still in office. But I do think about things like there's an old phrase, white ice is colder. Some of us still have that mentality that Bank of America just got to be better than Citizens Trust Bank in Atlanta. They
Mhm.
offer more services. They open 24/7. You can bank on your phone. We've got to get into a more collective mindset. For a while, I lived near some folk who were Asian Indians, and they operated convenience stores and motels and liquor stores and whatnot. But you know what they did every Thursday night? They had dinner together and decided how they would divide the profit from that week's business.
Mhm.
Nobody's child was looking for a job. Nobody had to worry about where they would start a business because that community would absorb them into their arms and help them get on their feet and make this system work for them. I don't know how we do it, but this idea of a collective approach to economic progress is something that we really ought to explore.
And I think that if we did that, we would be respected and treated very different, State Representative Myers, because all of the division that other people, outsiders see. I'll give you this I'll give you this very quickly before I pitch this to you. We used to have the Push Excel Basketball Classic, and the Bears were our host, and the Bulls were our host, as you remember, Dr. Starks and Dwight McKee. And one of the superstar players rolled his eyes when he came over to Reverend. He did not want to come over and say hello. And the white owner of the Bulls was infuriated. He said, "Does he know all that he owes you?" My father said, "Don't worry about it." He said, "No, no, 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 no." He said, "That kind of disrespect, Reverend." He said, "I can't respect that." But State Representative Myers, because you're seeing this, you know, it's coming at us legislatively. Thank goodness you got Tony Evers, but you have not had that. You had Rick Walker before. You know, staunch
So,
right winger. I mean,
let me just, even with what you just said, Santita, yes, we have Tony Evers, but that doesn't mean that I agree with Tony Evers every single time he
Right?
does something either as a Democrat, because similar to what Dwight McKee said and what Dr. Stark said, and even what Attorney Mathis and Dr. Yuri talked about, I have a theory that I've talked about with some of my friends, and it's not based on anything scientific, based solely on, just friendships and people that I know and what I've observed. It is, you talked about a mindset. I had a conversation with my mother once, and she talked about how poor she was when she grew up in Mississippi. And she said, "Well, when our parents died, they didn't have anything to leave us."
You're
And I said,
right.
"You need to stop saying that." And she said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Your parents left you land. You never lived on rented property in your life. So when you grew up, you and daddy built a house for me and my sister to live in. Matter of fact, you built more than one. So you showed us what it was to have an ownership mentality." I said, "What I've noticed is that some of my peers who their families lived in a certain way where they were always renters. You talk about a mindset and a mentality. They only knew that that was the ceiling and they could go no further. It was known that you were going to rent, you were going to be poor in a certain, aspect of it. But I didn't grow up that way." I said, "But your father and mother made it so that you never went hungry, even though you were poor by standards. You grew up on an organic farm, Ma. That's what it's called today. It would be worth so much more if you all were still farming right now. So you have to change the mindset of what it was that you had." I said, "You never went hungry because you grew everything you ate," which is a luxury that most folks want now. So when you think about it from that perspective, it's what you see. So what you and Dwight and all of you all talked about what you could see. You could see that Dr. So-and-so lived down the street from you. So that's something that you could become. You saw what a middle class life looked like because you had the opportunities that
Yeah.
were afforded to you by the work of your parents. So I agree wholeheartedly. I'm a recipient of the sacrifices of others. They may not have looked like what you wanted it to look like, but I could see it as what it was for. I never lived anywhere that I've rented outside of being an adult in DC. And I really got out of that situation real quick and bought my own house. But all of those things, it's a mindset that you have to move forward. So that makes sense. To Dwight's point, I was shaking my head when you said you have to think about being Black first. That's how I approach life every day. And especially as a politician, I look at it, which is why you brought up the Tony Evers situation. One of the biggest fights I had with the governor was about losing Black representation in
Yeah,
the city
I'm
of
back.
Washington,
Sorry.
because it was
Excuse
a
me.
national trend to say, well, we need to have these opportunity districts in each state. But I said, wait. That means that you're going to take away one or two of the seats that have been pretty much statistically earmarked to be Black seats.
We got 1 minute
To do that. So yes, approaching it from that perspective, thinking culturally first versus being inclusive for everybody, because everybody gonna look out for themselves first. So that's the point.
No, I mean, you know what? At the end of the day, I'm just saying, as we are looking at what it is that we need, I think
we are the world until you become the one on the menu. That's
get off the menu, get your seat at the table. You deserve it. People keep saying that immigrants built this country. No, we built this country, and other people got jobs here. And we need to understand who we are. And when we understand that, everything is going to change and people will approach us very differently. I love you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Dwight McKee. Thank you, Wisconsin State Representative Lakeisha Myers. Thank you, General Counsel of the National Council of Negro Women, Attorney Janice Mathis from Greenville, and Reverend Dr. Todd Urey, and the esteemed Dr. Robert Starks. I'm sending you all so much love. Remember, please go to the Jackson Show YouTube channel, like, subscribe, click the bell, and just continue to support us. I love everybody. God bless you. See you tomorrow on the Santita Jackson Show.